Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. And I hope that my screen is sharing with you so you can see the slide. That this evening we've got the first of our two webinars on why and how to regulate software in the healthcare setting. These webinars have arisen because, as we've discussed the development of medical devices in the healthcare setting, it became clear to us that software can be, by its very nature, defined as a medical device and therefore becomes subject to the regulatory requirements. And we thought it might well be an issue that people were not quite so aware of. And so we wanted to put together these two sessions. In this evening's session, Dr. Matt Guy from Southampton and Haroon Chugtai from UCL are going to talk to us about why we should consider this. And I think it's going to be really quite fascinating, the illustrations they have and the things they have to say. One of the things I want to point out on this slide, at the bottom of the slide there is the address for the office at IPEM. And if you have any further inquiries about any of these issues, please feel free to email the office. The format of this evening is going to be that Matt and Haroon are going to speak for 15 minutes each, and then we will have a question and answer session with our four panelists. So we'll be joined by Marco and by James Lees, and any questions that you would like to ask, you can post on the Q&A function on the Zoom toolbar, which is either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen when you set it up. So please feel free to post questions at any point at any time. Once we've heard from Matt and Haroon, then we will move to the Q&A session, and we'll go to the questions. If you don't have a chance to post and write it, we will also accept questions by raising the hand, using the raise hand function again on the Zoom toolbar. But I will stop the sharing of my screen, and on that basis, I will prepare to hand over to Matt, who's going to speak to us as the first speaker about why. Thank you, Matt.
And thank you, Warren. Hopefully everyone can see the screen okay. Yeah,
Yes,
my name's
thank
Matt
you.
Guy. I'm based down at Southampton, as you say, in medical physics. I'm a clinical scientist, initially in nuclear medicine by initial training, and retrained as a healthcare designer a few years ago. I lead a small scientific computing team, which we formed back in, I think, 2015 on the back of a pitch to need to get ready for what were then new or pending new regulations in the medical device field that would get a hit or impact our software activity. So very pleased to get the ball rolling today. What I'd like to do is just start by making sure that we're all sort of aligned in the same direction in terms of what we're going to be focusing on with these talks. So we'll be concentrating on software that would be classed as a medical device in the UK, and the MHRA have a very good decision-making tool on their website. I'm not expecting all of you to be able to read that screen grab there. What's important or what's most useful is that link down the bottom here. Essentially, if it has a medical purpose, it's likely to be a medical device. If you're just transferring data around from one point to the other, probably not. If you're just recording results on your QA program, also likely not a device. And at its core, the regulations are there to assure safety. It's checking that you've identified risks, you've mitigated what you can, you've weighed them up against the potential benefit for patients. And it's also there to make sure actually it's likely to be usable by the intended users in the context that it's designed for. I'm not going to say any more on those points now. I think that's something that Haroon will touch on later. and James and Marco in part 2 next week also. What I'd like to do today instead is to focus on whether the regulations help us in meeting the needs that we're trying to address with the software that we're writing. And of course, those needs may be the direct needs of patients, they may be the needs of their carers, who may be informal and untrained, right through to healthcare professionals, and also the needs of the wider healthcare system. And I personally think the answer to that question is, in terms of regulations contribution there, is yes, it can help, but it's not going to get there. It can be a very significant component in this, but it's not going to get there on its own. We're going to need to think about the clinical pathways, the commercial realities, the wishes of research and innovation funders, assuming that they actually want to see or get closer to a clinical end product, for example. And so let's start breaking this down. I'm assuming that most of us on this call are working in NHS organisations. So I'm kind of hoping that we're likely to start with a common aim of wanting to identify a healthcare problem and cracking on with solving for this need in this scenario using some software. Now, we're certainly not alone in wanting to do this. Perhaps our expectation may be that commercial enterprises, medtech, are also going to be well aligned to this need. After all, they're going to want a target audience to be able to sell their solutions into. And there are also other academic and scientific groups feeding the research and innovation stream that will hopefully propel solutions into clinic. But our experience, and I wager perhaps for some of you on this call as well, is that particularly for smaller patient populations, when you're in that darker, sort of less well-lit elements of clinical pathways, dare I say nuclear medicine, brachytherapy, for example, you may find the reality is actually more like this. There's a far bigger gap up here. There's far less common ground than really would be ideal. And that's where historically in-house manufacture, in-house software development has attempted to fill that gap and deliver for that need. And it's done that in a variety of forms. Well, for us historically at Southampton, it's meant that actually we've ended up delivering everything from automating brain perfusion processing through to serving up drug calculators on an iPhone to be used in intensive care. These are both medical devices and both had an unmet need. Now, historically, those gaps were filled by interested staff in, for example, medical physics and engineering, but also in pharmacy and laboratories and other areas of NHS institutions. But patients and clinicians are increasingly connected, increasingly empowered and aware of what they can be achieved. And leveraging social media, leveraging support groups, as well as now through that connectivity, having access to umpteen developers who are genuinely keen to help, either from a community or from a commercial perspective. So in many ways, that connectivity has been a positive, but it's generated both ideas and empathy and given patients and healthcare professionals support. But it can also lead to unregulated solutions appearing. So what I'd like to do now is to give you an example of what happens when this gap meets that evolving environment. What solutions emerge in the vacuum of that formal input from the healthcare system. And I'd like to do that by summarizing a journey that a bunch of patient community solutions have delivered, broadly come under a hashtag of "We're Not Waiting." Before we dive in here, let me just be absolutely 100% clear. I'm not advocating their use, nor am I sharing these as particularly being sort of, rocket science solutions. What I'd like you to do, please, is to reflect on why hundreds of people from a patient community decided to actively help to build these solutions, and why getting on to 100,000 people have actively used these solutions worldwide. Now, plenty of others have obviously decided not to use them, but for those many thousands who have, why on balance did they decide that it was better for them in terms of their overall risk and quality of life to plump to use an unregulated community solution to help them get on with managing their type 1 diabetes. Now, it's unlikely that everyone on this call is going to agree with the decisions made by this group of individuals. As I said, that's not my aim here. And for full disclosure, as a private citizen and certainly not part of my NHS role, I was also part of this group over the last few years. So the first stage in this journey is a remote monitoring step. Now, if you're living with type 1 diabetes, you're 100% reliant on the external administration of insulin to keep alive, thanks to your overeager immune system. You're constantly juggling insulin on board versus the carbohydrate that you have that's active in your system, and other things like exercise and emotions, trying to keep your blood sugar levels in a safe range. If you go out of that range, or if you start bobbing up and down excessively, you're going to cause immediate and long-term morbidity from that. If you're lucky, you've got access to an insulin pump that will deliver insulin and a continuous glucose monitor, a little electrode that slips under the skin to try and estimate your blood sugar level every 5 minutes. So our first step on this journey is liberating that information from the patient, getting it up in the cloud and getting it delivered to a remote display. You might want to do that if you've got a patient who's too young or vulnerable, for example, someone living with dementia, who's unable to respond directly to that data, is unable to calculate how much insulin to give or glucose to take. Or even if you're an adult who gets by and self-manages quite happily most of the time, but is unable to respond to, say, a rapidly falling glucose level at night when you're asleep. So Nightscout picks up that continuous data really through the cloud to a remote device. Now, in itself, as a remote display, that's not a medical device. But if you propose making treatment decisions from that data, then it would become a medical device. And just making that clear, as this is the first stage of a journey where we absolutely end up in medical device territory. So the next stage was to get alarms from insulin pumps when they're out of earshot. So just a small microphone that's used at this point in the evolution of this to capture the various beeps and whistles and noises that insulin pumps make to tell you it's got an occlusion alarm or you've run out of insulin or something like that. Generally speaking, small children don't respond to those alarms; they completely ignore them. So it's good to have access to those. But what we really wanted was full real-time access, wireless access to the insulin pump data, and this is what we achieved a few years ago now. So in this point, you're now getting, this is a 24-hour plot of blood glucose levels. You want to be between these two lines here, and you can see a bit of a roller coaster going on, but you can also see lots of events. So you can see every alarm on the pump, that's the orange dots, every insulin and carbohydrate that's been given, so the blue and white dots, every finger prick is the red dots there. So you can see a very active day for that individual. And of course, at this point, we've now enabled potentially a more timely care for that patient, so more timely intervention because of liberating that full set of data to be able to decide whether there's intervention that's needed or whether they're safely being managed. Now, at this point, we're in what's called an open loop mode. So we are manually trying to drive or keep these glucose levels nice and flat. And you can see that in this 24-hour period, we made rather a mess of it. And I don't mind saying that because it's me who's made the mess of it during that period. I'm not blaming anyone else for sure. But with all that data, you can hopefully see that it may, or there's a feasibility then of handing over some of that decision making to an algorithm to actually make, give the algorithm some level of intelligence in terms of making decisions as to how to manage those glucose levels. And this is what's called closing the loop. So this is when the computer, the software is actually now making decisions as to when to give insulin, how to give it. And so what I'm show you now is the snapshot from Sunday when I put these slides together, of 24-hour period again. Using that automated algorithm, you can see that it's not perfect. There are times when we go out of range, there's times when we drop rapidly, but it's much flatter than before. That equates to lower risk going forward for the patient. It equates to a better day basically as well. You're going to have a better night's sleep when you've got something like this going on rather than that roller coaster. And just by the way, if you thought that was a fluke with those 2 day shots, well, that's 3 months. Look at the interquartile range here. So this is on the open system, manually doing the best we can. And then this is on the computer aided closed loop system, where we try and squeeze the range in and keep things nice and flat overall. So as I said, what I wanted to do was to share, to provoke thought and reflection, and maybe we'll see later some debate. Personally, I find it interesting that the healthcare system globally, the regulated healthcare system, has put thousands of patients into a position where essentially they had to decide on using an unregulated piece of software versus what they perceive to be a lower risk and better quality of life for themselves. That community group was around 4 to 5 years ahead of any commercial supplier in delivery, hence the hashtag of "We're not waiting." Indeed, one of the major vendors still doesn't even have a remote monitoring solution for its customers. So the FDA were actively involved and engaged during this process. One of the things that's come out of the community activity here has been development with the FDA's backing of standards for interoperability between the hardware and software components. And that closed loop system that I showed you a few slides back has now been rewritten and submitted to the FDA for formal approval. So this brings us back to our challenge. How do we fill that gap when we know that if we do nothing, then unregulated solutions are likely to occur? So my final slide, and what I'd like to leave you with, is what I personally feel is our opportunity as a profession. I think we do, with our position in healthcare organizations, our core training, the networks that we operate in, we have the potential to solve real healthcare problems using regulated software solutions. And we may well be able to use that knowledge and those connections, not least to patients and healthcare professionals actually living with these issues, dealing with these issues day to day that we interact with on a daily basis, to better align medtech and innovation funding as well. So to bring those spheres closer lined up aligned with the actual need. I believe we have the opportunity to shape a pathway, not just a quality management system that charts the journey through to deployment of safe software solutions that meet patient and healthcare professionals' needs, whilst also meeting the regulatory requirements, and to do so in a reasonably timely manner. It's never going to be super quick when regulation is involved, but it can be reasonably quick, let's put it that way. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention and time, and I'll hand over to Haroon for part 2. Many thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. Let's see. Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Haroon. I'm a research software developer at UCL, where I'm working on medical image computing problems, specifically on managing health data, medical data, and enabling processing by researchers. Before that, I trained as a clinical scientist at UCLH, and I still have contact with the clinicians in UCLH through the UCLH Biomedical Research Center, where we try to get some data from UCLH over to research. And I'm going to be speaking about some of the wider challenges in developing software and the kind of risks there are with developing software and with then deploying that in a healthcare setting, and leading on to why regulations are helpful. So Matt had a good introduction into why software is used, and it's very much a very large part of healthcare delivery, and it's something that is unlikely to change anytime soon. There's been pushes by NHS England through the long-term plan to set a direction of widespread digitally enabled care, and that's only going to introduce more and more technologies from a variety of places that have a place in healthcare. The Department of Health and Social Care have released a guidance note on the good practice for digital and data-driven health technologies, which is a really interesting read. I recommend everyone have a look at some point. But deploying and using software in healthcare delivery results in overlap between lots of different pieces of regulation, lots of different systems, as well as varying professional and ethical standards, both from the perspective of healthcare, but also from the technology side of things and from maybe data ethics as well. And regulations and guidelines aid both innovators in terms of setting what's expected of them, but also, as was mentioned before, healthcare organizations and patients in assuring safety and reliability. And to reiterate, they allows assurance for healthcare organizations and also allowing innovators to know what's expected of them on all fronts. And assurance for healthcare organizations includes allowing them to fulfill their duty to provide the best care to patients, but also providing the best value to the system in whatever way you're measuring value. So the reason you need to be quite careful and considered when deploying any sort of software-based solution, and those of you that work in healthcare settings as clinical scientists are probably well aware, is that it introduces a risk, and the risk here is of a software-based solution failure. And failure can occur in many different ways, and the impact of those can have quite devastating effects depending on where your software is deployed. So by failure, I mean anything from calculation errors and processing errors. Maybe your software, it has an error in a formula it's using and is therefore giving the wrong output. Maybe your software is data-driven and is trying to do some sort of machine learning to classify something. Maybe its underlying data is unfair or biased, so you're getting consistently unrepresentative results. Maybe has poorly designed failure modes and error handling. The example of Therac 25 comes to mind, where it couldn't handle certain situations, and that resulted in patient deaths. But also some other types of failures can occur with software systems. You could have failures in a way because of unusable data formats where you can't actually use the data you've captured in that system or use it for other parts of the patient's care. The systems may have a lack of support, and that may be especially true of in-house developed systems that don't have much of a support wrapper around them. So they could fail and no one's available to correct them, or there could be bugs that are known but never fixed, and that introduce additional risks. And the impacts, as some of them I've mentioned already, are they could have everything from delays in the application domain. So for example, a PAC system goes down or something's interfacing with the PAC system, causing it to be overloaded. That could introduce delays to a whole host of things across the hospital trust if images can't get where they need to go. There's also risks of financial costs and reputational costs based on that. But perhaps most importantly, or indeed most importantly, is the fact that these systems have the potential to cause harm or distress or actions leading to death as well if they're not properly handled. And that's sort of a bit of a motivation of why software, however you're developing it and wherever you're developing it, needs to be managed in some way. And not all of these will apply to every piece of developed software that's used in healthcare, but just sort of to set the scene. And to show that there's a lot more to a high quality software solution than just good coding. There's a lot of stuff to consider about the application domain, whether it's suitable for where it's deployed, whether there's support for it, whether it's accepted by its end users and used in the correct way. And if it's not used in the correct way, what changes need to be made so that you work best with whoever's your end user, be that staff or patients. And what I'd like to focus on for the majority of this bit is on some of the domains that go beyond code and introducing what the challenge is and why they're important, not going into much depth about how to solve them, as I'll leave that to the talk for next week. So perhaps most importantly for clinical software is that we're developing in a very complex environment, and we need to make sure that the solution actually addresses the problem we're going for. It's not just something that seems cool to develop and doesn't actually meet user needs or have a properly defined outcome. And the reason for that is that it fits into the wider ecosystem. It's something that is useful. There's also a challenge around technical assurance. So this is more on the coding aspect of it, and to ensure that whatever you develop is fit for purpose, it's reproducible, it's accurate, it's sustainable, it's reliable, it's suitably performant, and you probably need to evidence that so you can, so that there's confidence that it's been done to high standard and all the technical issues managed. So that's probably the aspect a lot of people who are closer to the coding consider the most, but it's only one in a large variety of things. There's obviously the issue of clinical safety. Anything that's deployed into a healthcare environment must be clinically safe to use, and that's something that should be considered from the get-go and by design, rather than grabbing a clinician at the end, asking them to check if it's okay. And that's probably a little bit easier to do in certain healthcare settings as you're working along with these colleagues, but another bit that's important to consider. Healthcare services are also for everyone. So there's challenges around usability. Solutions have to be easy to use by all of your target audience, and not considering usability can lead to frustration, reduce adoption, and cause harm if people are resorting to workarounds or non-standard ways of using your solution that may introduce additional risks. There's also the question of moving data around. If the data can't go to where it needs to go and be used by those people who need to use it, you've essentially created a siloed system that can't inform the rest of a patient's care. It creates barriers, which again can impact care, as well as mean that your software can't really be used to its full potential. And there's also wider issues about ethics. That could be research ethics, or it could be data ethics. With data ethics especially, you need to have assurance that whatever you're doing is fair, that it works for all populations, that it doesn't only work for people of a certain gender or a certain race. And part of that is to maintain trust in the public and avoid any unintended harms, ensuring that everyone's rights are safeguarded, which also leads on to information governance and ensuring that everything is collected in a legal way, which is something that people may not consider when you're developing a small thing in-house, but that is no justification for ignoring the information governance challenges and ensuring that whatever you're collecting is appropriate for your solution. And part of protecting that is cybersecurity. Software solutions don't exist in a bubble. They're often connected to a wide variety of other devices and other information systems, which introduces potential vectors for attack. So there needs to be assurance that developed solutions have some measure, or at least, or have a good industry standard security practices. Everything from making sure you do change the default passwords, to segregating things on a network. And also digital solutions that are intending to provide treatment, which may not be a lot of the things that people in this audience may be interested in, do have to show that they deliver the benefits that they promise. And there are some nice healthcare frameworks for showing how digital health technologies can be proved to be efficacious. But that sort of evidence is needed to deploy something in a health organization or a safe environment if it's targeting that sort of thing. So that's been a little bit of a flavor of the various challenges and hopefully a stepping stone for some discussion. You can see there's a fair bit of things to consider above clinical safety and above just the technical validity of what you're developing, but regulations and guidelines help ensure that all of these things are considered, and ultimately that the safety of everyone involved is upheld. And to find out more about how to implement some of these things or how to address them, tune in next week to the second part of this seminar series. But in summary, developing software for healthcare settings is at a crossroads of quite a few different regulatory systems and professional standards. Good software solutions are more than just good coding. There's a lot of engineering and healthcare specific challenges, but regulation helps ensure that the appropriate systems are in place so that these challenges are considered and people protected. And with that, I'll hand back to Warren.
Thank you, Haroon, and thank you, Matt and Haroon, for a really good introduction to the challenges and the issues. As you can, I think you might be able to see on the screen, we are now joined by our two speakers for next week. That's James Lees and Marco Rosado. And they will be talking, as Haroon just said, about how to do that next week. Just before we go to the question and answer session, I want to seize this opportunity to set this in context. And so I'm going to share my screen with all of you. If you go to the IPEM home page, you will see there that there is there's a tab, Scientific Journals and Publications. And at the bottom of that Scientific Journals, there's free publications. And the background to these two webinars is that a clinical engineering working group from IPEM have just released this guidance for health institutions on in-house manufacture and use of medical devices. And from what Matt was saying at the start of his talk, you will appreciate that medical devices can mean software, or it might mean actual physical devices, but it can also include software. And in fact, the guidance also is relevant to non-medical devices, so software or devices which are not used. Now, this guidance is there freely accessible for everybody, and it refers to this issue of software as a medical device. And so I want to point you to that. Then the other thing that I want to just remind everyone of is that if you have any further questions, we as an institution are going to work further on refining guidance in regard to the this software as a medical device. And so if you, anyone who's participating in this webinar, if you would like to contribute to or be involved in that discussion, please email the office. That's office@ipem.ac.uk. And indicate to them that you'd be willing to work on this regulatory software question. The guidance as it was has refers to software. It has an annex which we're going to refine and further work on. But now I want to come back to the issue of what's been raised today and open the meeting for questions and for discussions. I noticed that we don't have any questions in the Q&A listing yet, so I'm going to kick off by perhaps referring firstly to Matt, but anyone else feel free to chip in. Matt, you mentioned in passing through that it was really the unmet needs which gave rise to the activities and which drove the response in this way. And so I wanted to raise this question of unmet needs and how they fit in and where we are with that process.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. I think let me try and dissect your question there as best I can. I guess what I'm trying to by deliberately starting with that unmet need and sort of building from there. are trying to just present the sort of broader environment, the broader sort of situation that we find ourselves in terms of making sure that we're creating, and Haroon touched on this as well, that we are actually creating software that needs to be created. You know, we are developing devices that actually have a proven need, and I think what I was trying to achieve, certainly during my talk, was to express that I felt that the environment that we've been in historically, where we've sort of almost silently and quietly sort of filled some of that need, is certainly not visible to us and to healthcare generally, but we've attempted to fill some of this by in-house manufacturer within the likes of medical physics and engineering groups across NHS trusts historically. We've done it kind of fairly quietly generally, and a lot of places have sort of done it fairly independently. Now, this is going to change under the new medical device regulations, in terms of there's going to be a regulatory push to do things, and the how is going to change. And we'll come on to more of that next week, I think, with James and Marco presenting. What I saw it as an opportunity to reflect on how we could build beyond the sort of the core, the hub of what's the existing medical device directive, what will become the MDR, as far as we know, when that goes. Eventually goes live, if you like, for the UK, yeah, I think it's just trying to take a broader picture and also reflect on the fact that if we don't do it as healthcare professionals, then there won't be silence. There will be activity from elsewhere, and that will almost certainly be unregulated. And that, whilst there's lots of ideas and lots of skills within that unregulated environment, lots of brain power, I think we're missing a trick as a profession, because we're not providing a system, a framework on which to safely hang those efforts, and to drive that effort round into a regulated framework back into sort of broader clinical uptake. Does that answer your question? I've had a stab at it anyway.
No, indeed. Does any of the other panelists want to add anything to that? No. So we have had a few questions. Firstly, Justin McCarthy has pointed out that the MHRA infographic is very useful, but it's based on the MDD classification rules. That's the old classification rules, and the new MDR rules are stricter, particularly for most software. And Justin said he doesn't anticipate this being changed in any way in the GB regulations. And thank you, Justin, for that question, because that also highlights one of the things that we saw was a driver for the need for these webinars, which is that we are currently in this interim period when it's not quite clear what the regulatory framework is. But does anyone want to pick up on that point about the MDR regulations being slightly tighter about software, and what we see as the roadmap on that?
I don't think that MDR is tighter on software, in the sense the MDD and the MDR, they delegate much of the interpretation and execution to ISO standards, which are, when harmonized, they give a presumption of conformity. So there are new standards coming up with updates, but I don't think that's how typically more regulations. I mean, we need to distinguish between standards and regulations. The regulations are the law. The standard is a way in which you could comply to the law, which is let's say pre-approved. I mean, it's recognized as a valid way to do so. So more standards have been produced and are constantly updated, but they regulation standard always somewhat trail behind the cutting edge of technology. So when you work in at that edge, you need to be very careful of what you're doing regardless, and not just rely on the standards.
Fabrizio Franzon has contributed, saying their understanding is that the new EU MDR are not applied to us, but the MDD 93. And certainly our understanding is partially that the application of the new MDR was held up and then avoided by the Brexit legislation. But we anticipate that the UK will head in a similar direction to the MDR. And that when regulation is finally introduced by government or by the agencies, that it will probably follow the same framework as the MDR. Is that a fair thing to say, panelists?
Yeah, just been catching up on what's happening now because of Brexit in the UK. The MDR, it's not applicable in the UK, and neither are the MDDs anymore, although there is some transition period, there's some grace, which I'm not going to get into the details because I just heard of them. What is also true is that currently all of the ISO standards that have been used so far to give a presumption of conformity have been recognized by the UK government. There's a list of, they call them approved standards, although that is no change at all because all the ISO standards and IC standards always had the national version, which was a verbatim copy with the BS in front which stands for British Standard in front of it, or yen or others. So currently, nothing has changed in practice other than the procedure to go through for certification, which needs to go through, same documents and different letterheads to same organization with a different name. That's what's changing now, but obviously there always is the potential for divergence in the future. We do not know that, but the short answer is that in what you do day by day is changed. What you need to do for filing, what you need to do day by day has not changed. What you need to do for filing has changed, but it's very similar to what was there before.
Excellent, thank you. Now I want to jump in because Ioannis Argyridis had asked a question also very much earlier and asked, does the panel consider that there are enough regulations and or guidelines on how to develop high quality software as a medical device? Are there enough regulations and guidance? So
I've answered that on in writing, actually. That's why we didn't listen to the first question. It's a matter of opinion, actually. So the regulations for software, the standard reference is only one. It's called IC 62304. I'm going to talk about it briefly in my session. Plus another one, which actually, given what we discussed today, which is software as a medical device. The applicable one is 82304, which is just a shell that includes 62304 with some other things, which I'm not going to get into right now. It's a standard that does not give any technical detail. It talks about the process to follow. There's a lot of things that you could do and you should do on a more technical level that exist in other standards. Chiefly one called 61508, which is a functional safety standard used in a variety of industries, but that is not directly applicable to medical software. So that it becomes important only for really complex systems where you need to really look into applying those principles. So whether the regulation that we have are enough or not, I think it's, in my opinion, no in some cases, and you wish we had more guidance and there's a degree of interpretation, but then some people think that any regulation is too much regulation, but then we're getting into politics.
Okay, so then I want to jump in. There are a couple of questions that are similar, but firstly, Marcus Durrand has asked, should we be working towards enhancing in-house manufacture or regulate it out so that solutions can only be developed by certified organizations? That's a good question.
Can I jump in on that then, Maureen?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might have said at the very beginning of my presentation, the reason why we've got a small scientific computing team at Southampton was absolutely because sort of 4 or 5, well, no, more than that, 6 years ago now, I could see the kind of juggernaut of the MDR kind of coming, and that removed the in-house exemption for building devices sort of as you wish for pretty much, you know, for in-house use only. I think there's another question there actually that I could probably weave into this answer into is around basically, you know, how do you convince your trust that you should invest in this? Well, the magic bullet, if you like, at Southampton was to basically list everything that was currently done across the organization, as far as I could see, that was provided in-house that would be classed as a medical device, and basically give them the fait accompli that if we don't sort this out at some point, you know, the system, if you like, would get round to realizing that that shouldn't be taking place, because it wasn't being built and maintained and post-market surveillance, etc. You know, that or post-deployment surveillance, to meet the needs of what would become the MDR, these sort of new regulations. So that was the drive. It was basically the drive there was, you know, what are we going to lose? I think the question, coming back to the original question of should we enhance in-house or should we regulate it out? I think I come back to my point around these smaller patient populations in these smaller areas. I think the honest answer is that if you drive it out, then healthcare and patients and clinicians are going to be all the poorer, because those needs will still be unmet, because you won't suddenly get commercial organizations jumping in, because if they're trying to do something that they need to go through all the hoops, including the CE marking, to get you know, a market out of this, you know, to go beyond an organization, then you know, the commercial, you know, the regulations haven't changed the commercial realities of what it costs to go through those processes. So you're going to leave that gap, and you're going to end up with unregulated solutions, like I showed you with the diabetes example.
Yeah. And Matt, while you were talking on that, notice that Caroline Rudland had asked if you have any advice for small or single person departments, and you're kind of hinting towards that. Do you want to take it further and talk about the people in small departments or on their own in dealing with this kind of thing?
So I think if your aim, Caroline, is to develop in-house software, and you're wondering how you do it in a small department where you can't, you know, suddenly leverage out, you know, extra individuals like that, then I honestly think you know, one of the answers that we as a profession could be looking to provide is sharing of the solutions. So, you know, we do not all have to, you know, we don't have to build ground up in every single department across the land. I think that would, you know, we're not sharing, just to be clear, we're not sharing the devices, because then that, you know, we then break the kind of in-house manufacturer kind of bubble, if you like. But you know, we could potentially share what we'll see next week. You know, the core of this is a quality management system that basically keeps you on track. If that can be shared, if that can be improved by that sharing as well, then that for me would be a solution that would potentially enable some smaller, you know, small doesn't mean not able to do it, big doesn't mean definitely able to do it, but you know, those departments feeling they don't have the resources readily available to go from zero to delivery, to still be engaged in this and still make a contribution. I don't know if the other panelists have thoughts on that, but
just if I can jump in before that we turn to the other panelists, that was my point about unmet needs. And Haroon also raised this issue that good computing is not just about coding, and that that I think it is about having the higher level thinking as well as doing the practical things well. And that's where we're hoping that IPEM can foster a collaborative effort with clinical engineers, with everyone across the healthcare sector, so that the higher level functions can be shared and added in. And not to steal your points from next week, James, but that's kind of the direction that we think it's going, isn't it?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of follow up from Matt's answer on that a little bit, and I think perhaps capture some of the other questions that are in that list at the same time. So I think Marcus's question about enhancing in-house software or regulating it out, I think actually this might be slightly controversial, but I think we want to do both. I think there's some cases where we should really be enhancing in-house manufacture. We need to meet the unmet need in those small patient populations, the kind of really complex, perhaps rare diseases and things like that. Those needs generally are not met by commercial manufacture, but I think there are some cases where some people are too quick to rush to develop their own solution in-house, where there's something that could be already on the market, could be cheap, safer, CE marked, etc. CE marking doesn't always imply it's better, but I think sometimes we should explore what's out there already before trying to reinvent the wheel. And in terms of sort of small single person departments, I think for small departments, it is possible to do this and still carry on. So our SciComm team is sort of 3 people, one of whom's not full-time in our team. And we've managed to deploy this and are starting to roll out the sort of digital pathway across the trust. But if you're trying to do it on your own, I think you're probably out of luck, to be fairly blunt, in that you need people to be helping you check what you're writing code. You need people to be helping you check your documentation. And the sort of the medical device software lifecycle is about more than just the one person. It's about all the stakeholders, the users, the developers, the people helping with your risk management, all of that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be hugely expensive. You don't have to have hundreds of people to help you do it, but I think you need a few people.
Yeah, I just wanted to latch onto that and a few other questions that leave some loose ends. And actually, the focus of my presentation would be on the, what the regulation really asks you to do. But there's no doubt that there is a barrier to comply with a regulation that is learning what they actually ask you to do. But then you can be lean in implementing what they ask you to do. There's a question because online, because I've used the term presumption of conformity. So just to reiterate what that means, and it's a bit of legalese. And this applies to the EU, although the situation is somewhat similar now here. So the MDDs is the law, and they outline some essential requirements. So one must comply with essential requirements. If one chooses to comply with one of the harmonized standards, like ISO 62304, then by demonstrating compliance to the standard, which is not the law, then there is a presumption of conformity, which is pre-packaged to the essential requirements. So, which means that a company could decide not to comply with ISO 62304, but they need to demonstrate how they meet the essential requirements independently. And that's more of a burden than just complying with the standard, which is, it's one step closer to what you actually need to do. They still need to require some interpretation. So typically you have the law, the standard, which is your presumption of conformity, and then you have your internal processes that can be audited to be compliant with a specific standard in some cases, not in all the cases. And so you comply to your own processes, and there's a whole chain that takes you to what the law is. So it's just a term to means compliance to harmonized standard keeps your presumption of conformity with the law. The other thing someone asked about AI and machine learning, that's again, the regulation is trailing behind the cutting edge of technology. So it can be a problem in the sense that the two problems with machine learning, one, it's demonstrating safety, because especially with deep learning, you don't actually know what it does inside, and it's very difficult to bound the outputs. So unless you have a way to guarantee safety by bounding the outputs in some way, then it's difficult to do. But assuming you've done it, which is possible, there's plenty of machine learning algorithms out there also in the medical industry already, then updating, it's a complication because typically it's a resubmission of your product because it's a change, it's a modification, which can be burdensome if one plans to do continuous learning in any way. But the FDA has published time ago, I mean, they're working on this. They recognize this as a difficulty in the industry. So they have first published a request for comments on a proposal to make this process leaner. And they recently published something else, which I do not know what it is because I haven't read it yet. I know some colleagues flagged it to me. I mean, it's something that came up last week or whatever. So I don't know whether it's the answer to that or anything, published a couple of days ago. So things are moving.
I just want to I just want to pick up on one of the questions from an anonymous attendee who asked, what advice would you give to someone who is trying to gain the support of senior management and the funding necessary within their NHS trust to build a strong workforce team? I want to throw that to the panel, but I also want to suggest, from my viewpoint, I've always argued that risk management and the risk-based approach is basically an accounting tool to point out to senior management the true costs of trying to cut corners and take a cheapskate approach. And the MDR and the MDD are very risk-based. And as Marco says, the essential requirements talks constantly about reducing the risk or obviating the risk. Do any of the panelists want to comment? And I guess to that next week as well, James.
Yeah, convincing senior management. I don't think it needs a lot of convincing. It's the law. I think it's the what I don't know, and probably the other panelists that work in this environment could shed some light. If you put something on the market that gets sold, someone pays a fee, you definitely need to comply with the regulation. There's no question about that. I know that because that's what I do professionally, before that happens, when something undergoes a clinical trial, it does not need to be CE mark. It needs to go through an ethical committee, which can waive, it's on their discretion what you need to comply with or not. But typically it's in a controlled environment. So when it's some of the things that I've heard are happening, it was completely new to me, where hospital or NHS trust develop their own in-house tools for their own use on patients. I do not know personally what the legal status of that is, but for something you put in a store and people pay for money, it's just a law. So there's no convincing necessary.
And Matt, sorry.
I was just going to follow up with that, in that I completely agree that you can use the sort of the whole language of risk is something that senior managers in the NHS are very familiar with, both from a genuine wish to not do harm to patients or staff, but also because of the financial impact in terms of either direct financial impact or loss of profile or position for the organisation because of an adverse event, for example. So I think I would encourage you to use everything that the MDR already and has in terms of that risk focus to highlight how you can both genuinely drive down the remaining risks in these products, but also have the evidence base to demonstrate that you've taken reasonable steps to do so as well. And as I said earlier, the other sort of parameter that I use personally at Southampton to get a small level of investment was around highlighting what would be lost. So what we would no longer be able to provide even within the organisation through the sort of the changing regulatory environment. But certainly the risk is what's brought most of the attention, and that's what's brought, for example, informatics to us at Southampton, wanting to build on our you know, a system that we were already building, which has been hugely positive, because obviously that brings with it not, you know, skills and resource and experience that we would never be able to tap into through growing small team within medical physics.
And I think, Matt, that leads on to Christopher Sibley-Allen's question about, do the panel have any view or data on variability in practice in different centres with respect to software regulation? I think you're implying in that direction as well, aren't you?
I think I've only got I've got anecdotal kind of evidence that it's highly variable in terms of how people are approaching it at the moment, and how far down the track they are from, you know, some organizations are from essentially just doing a kind of what I would term a kind of professional job, as in, you know, taking good care as a clinical scientist you'd expect somebody to take care of things, versus the you know, the level of detail and the steps that we'll see probably in next week's presentations, when you'll you know, you'll see the you know, the sort of full gamut of requirements from the MDR being sort of laid out in the solutions there under the sort of how to do it. Yeah, I think it's a challenge and an opportunity for the profession, though. I think that variability, you know, we can, yeah.
Yep, I think that's a very good point at which to draw this discussion to a close tonight, but to encourage and point people to next week's webinar, when we'll go deeper into those kind of questions. And I want to reassure all of our attendees that all the questions posted, we will assure, I want to assure you, we will ensure that all questions are answered. And again, I want to point out the communities of interest on the IPEM homepage, where you can also raise some of these issues, post a discussion. There's a computing and informatics community of interest there, or you can email the office at ipem.ac.uk if you have another question that you'd like us to discuss. But otherwise, I think we should hold all of the discussion over until 5 o'clock next Wednesday. Thank you, Matt and Haroon, for your presentations. Thank you, Marco and James, for your contributions. Thank you, everyone, for your involvement. And I look forward to seeing all of you, and even more people next week, when we look at how to do this. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Warren.